In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread that was fraying with every passing hour. If you walk through the streets of central London today, you will see monuments to the heroes of the Second World War, statues of Winston Churchill, and memorials to the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force. The story we tell ourselves about that war is a simple and heroic one, that Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine and spent every penny she had to save the world. But this is the version of history written for children. It is a version that ignores the cold, hard financial calculus of empire. If you want to understand why the Union Jack was lowered across the globe, and why the map of the world looks the way it does today, you have to look past the dogfights over Kent and the beaches of Normandy. You have to look inside the underground cabinet war rooms, where the men who ran the British government knew a terrifying secret they dared not whisper to the public. The empire was not just bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding to death financially. Winston Churchill, the man whose voice was rallying the free world, sat at his desk to write a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a master of the English language, a man who could turn a phrase into a weapon. But in this letter, he had to perform a humiliating dance. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the workshop of the world, the empire that had defeated Napoleon, was completely and utterly broke. This is the story of the greatest liquidation sale in human history. It is the story of how the United States didn't conquer the British Empire with an army, but instead bought it, piece by piece, for a secret price that is still being paid today. To understand how the British line was forced to turn tail, we must first understand the world as it existed in 1940, a world where the only thing more dangerous than an enemy was a friend who held your wallet. By the winter of 1940, the British Empire was a titan with feet of clay. To the average citizen in Manchester or Birmingham, the empire was an immovable object, a crimson stain across the world map that represented eternal stability. But inside the ledger books of the Bank of England, the ink was a terrifying shade of red. Since the first shots were fired in 1939, Britain had been forced to do something it hadn't done for over a century. It had to go shopping. Modern warfare is not just about courage, it is about industrial throughput. To fight a total war, Britain needed more than just blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It needed millions of tons of American steel, millions of barrels of Texas oil, and an endless stream of aircraft engines from the factories of the Midwest. The problem was a piece of American legislation known as cash and carry. The United States, still officially neutral and scarred by the debts of the First World War, had a strict rule. If you wanted American weapons, you had to pay up front in gold, and you had to carry them away on your own ships. The result was a financial hemorrhage the likes of which the world had never seen. Week after week, British warships, the same ones meant to be guarding the English Channel, were being used as armored delivery trucks. They were loaded with heavy wooden crates filled with gold bars, shipped across the Atlantic, and unloaded at the Federal Reserve in New York. By December, the vaults were empty. The banker of the world had spent its entire inheritance. Churchill's letter to Roosevelt wasn't just a request for help. It was a confession of bankruptcy. He told the president that the cash and carry system was dead because the cash was gone. Britain was now a beggar at the door of its former colony. But in the cold, calculating world of geopolitics, there is no such thing as a free lunch. The Americans knew they had the British over a barrel. They knew that for the first time in history, the British Empire was a distressed asset, and the men in Washington, led by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, were not interested in charity. They were interested in a takeover. Before they would agree to help, they demanded a down payment, not in gold, which Britain no longer had, but in the very thing that made Britain a superpower, its global territory. The Americans were not looking for a partnership. They were looking for a liquidation. In early 1941, as the Luftwaffe's bombs turned London's history into rubble, the U.S. Navy sent a cruiser, the USS Tuscaloosa, to the British territory of Simonstown in South Africa. Its mission was not to provide escort or protection. It was there to collect a payment. The British were forced to hand over 150 million in gold bars, the very last of their reserves, as a sign of good faith before Washington would even discuss the possibility of credit. But the real price was not paid in gold. It was paid in the sovereignty of the British Empire's most strategic fortresses. Roosevelt proposed a deal that would become known as destroyers for bases. In exchange for 50 aging World War I-era American destroyers, ships the U.S. Navy largely considered obsolete, Britain was forced to hand over 99-year leases on a string of naval and air bases stretching from Newfoundland to British Guiana, including the critical outposts in Bermuda and the Bahamas. To the public, it was presented as a brotherly alliance of English-speaking peoples. But behind closed doors, the British negotiators were horrified. They realized they were handing the keys to the Western Hemisphere to their biggest rival. These bases were the fortress walls of the empire. They were the checkpoints that allowed the Royal Navy to project power across the Atlantic. By taking them, the United States was effectively evicting Britain from the Americas. Lord Lothian, the British ambassador to Washington, remarked that the Americans were beating us with a stick while we were drowning. The Americans knew that if Britain fell, they would inherit the world for free, but if Britain survived, they wanted to make sure it was too weak to ever challenge American commercial interests again. This was the birth of the special relationship, a term that has been used for decades to mask a brutal reality. It was not a marriage of equals, it was a mortgage. The United States was providing the life support, but it was also seizing the collateral. Even as the Lend-Lease Act was signed, promising an arsenal of democracy, the U.S. Treasury demanded that Britain liquidate its private holdings. British-owned companies in America, from Viscose to Shell Oil, were sold off at fire sale prices to American competitors. The British lion was being skinned while it was still alive, and the man holding the knife was its closest ally. While the Americans were dismantling the empire's physical assets in the Atlantic, a far more insidious trap was being laid in the East. To understand how Britain truly lost its grip on power, you have to look past the Mediterranean and toward the crown jewel of the empire, India. During the war, India was transformed into a massive industrial and military hub for the British war effort. Millions of Indian soldiers were recruited, and millions of tons of supplies were shipped to the front lines. But Britain couldn't pay for any of it. Instead, they used a financial sleight of hand that would make a Ponzi architect blush: the sterling balances. Essentially, the British government forced the Indian economy to provide goods and services on credit. They printed local rupees to pay for war supplies, but the backing for those rupees was nothing more than an IOU held in a bank account in London. This was a forced loan on an imperial scale. By 1945, Britain owed India and other colonies over $3 billion, a debt they had no way of repaying in actual gold or dollars. The Americans, watching from across the ocean, saw this mountain of debt as their final opening. In 1944, at a mountain resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, the world's financial architects met to design the post-war order. The British representative was the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes. He arrived thinking he could negotiate a deal to save the pound. He was wrong. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, had a single-minded goal: to kill the proud imperial preference system that allowed Britain to trade exclusively with its colonies. The Americans used Britain's desperation to force a brutal concession. They demanded that the British pound be made convertible, meaning anyone holding British pounds, like the Indians or Egyptians, could immediately swap them for American dollars. It was a financial death sentence. The Americans knew that as soon as the war ended, everyone would want dollars to buy American, their machinery and grain. By forcing convertibility, they ensured that the capital of the British Empire would flow directly into the pockets of Wall Street. The British were no longer the world's masters. They were merely a conduit through which the wealth of the colonies was funneled to the new superpower. The sterling trap had snapped shut, leaving Britain with a choice: surrender its global trade monopoly or face a total currency collapse. By 1945, the victory bells ringing across London had a hollow sound. Britain had won the war, but it had lost the peace. The secret bill for World War II had finally come due, and the United States was moving in to collect. When the Lend-Lease taps were abruptly shut off just days after the Japanese surrender, the British economy went into a state of shock. They were left with a mountain of debt, a crumbling infrastructure, and a global empire they could no longer afford to police. The final act of this financial tragedy took place in 1946, when Britain was forced to take a $3.75 billion loan from the U.S. just to keep the lights on. But this wasn't a loan between allies. It was a restructuring agreement for a bankrupt firm. The conditions were absolute. Britain had to dismantle its trade barriers and allow the American dollar to become the world's undisputed reserve currency. The British Empire didn't collapse because of a revolution or a lost battle. It was liquidated in a series of boardroom meetings in Washington and New Hampshire. When we look back at the map of the 1920s, covered in that defiant imperial pink, we see a world that felt permanent. But history teaches us that permanence is an illusion maintained by a healthy balance sheet. The United States didn't need to fire a single shot at a British soldier to dismantle the largest empire in history. They simply waited for the compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most effective way to conquer a rival is to become their only source of credit. The British people were told they were making a noble sacrifice for freedom, and in a moral sense, they were. But in the cold, hard light of economics, they were participants in a distressed asset sale. The empire was traded for survival, and the special relationship became the polite euphemism for a nation that had lost its keys to the vault. Sovereignty is not just about flags, anthems, or borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. Britain emerged from the smoke of 1945 as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy, proving that once you hand over your wallet to your protector, you have already been conquered. This is the Wealth History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the truth behind the ledgers. History is written by those who argue it, and I'll be reading your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.